Well, it's Sunday, and that always means a spate of new opinion polls, and they make for fascinating, if a little confusing, reading. There are 5 new polls today which have the Conservative lead over Labour anywhere from 6 to 14 points. So what's going on? Well, Professor John Curtice is the expert we always turn to at times like this, and he joins me ever faithfully from Glasgow. John Curtice, take us through these polls, because they seem to be all over the place.
Well, they may seem to be all over the place, but in truth there is a very consistent key message from them. Actually, 4 of these 5 polls, if you compare them with what they were saying before the Conservative manifesto launch on the 18th of this month, 4 of them say the Conservatives are down by 2 points, 4 of them say the Labour vote is up by 4 points, and the 5th poll, by the way, also suggests the movement's in the same direction. So the clear, consistent message from the polls is that the Conservative lead has narrowed. Now, why does this matter? It matters because we are now in a position where the leads are such that the Conservatives can no longer be sure of getting the landslide majority they want. Now, you're right, some polls are suggesting they really are in trouble and it's getting to get rather close. Others suggest it's further apart. Now, the truth is there are 2 major sources of variation in the polls, which helps to underline the uncertainty that we're now at. The first is the polls agree young voters are going to vote Labour if they vote. Older voters are going to vote for the Conservatives. But the crucial thing is how many of all those younger voters turn out to vote. The second thing is whether the evidence in the polls that the Conservatives are advancing more in the north of England and the Midlands and elsewhere is realised in the ballot box. If it isn't realised, the Tories' chances of getting a landslide are now beginning to look rather remote. If it is, they could still well indeed get a majority of more than 80 or so.
Right, as you say, the broad message is that the Conservatives have lost some ground to varying degrees depending on which poll you look at. What about the Labour Party?
Oh, the Labour Party is gaining ground. Of course, truth has been gaining grounds in this election, certainly ever since week 1. They started at 26. They're now on average at 35. And it looks as though, particularly what seems to have happened, there were a lot of people out there at the beginning of this election campaign who were saying, well, I usually vote Labour, but the truth is I'm not very sure about Jeremy Corbyn. They seem to have decided that the Labour manifesto wasn't so bad after all. They've looked at Theresa May and they said, well, give me that choice. Then you know what, I'm going to stick with Labour. And I think for the most part what's happened is that Labour have managed to draw back into the fold some of their traditional voters who were disenchanted, together with perhaps also crucially some of those younger voters who've never voted before, who of course have always been a particular target for Jeremy Corbyn.
What's your reaction to previous polls and elections where there has been a feeling that some of the Labour support has been overstated? Do you think that could be a worry in this election too?
That's undoubtedly one of the uncertainties that faces the polls and therefore the rest of us in this election. Now, we had a conference on Friday in which it was quite carefully explained. The pollsters have, in various ways, been trying to correct the errors that resulted in overestimation of Labour support 2 years ago, in particular dealing with this issue of turnout amongst younger voters. So you shouldn't assume that the polls are just going to be wrong this time because they were wrong last time. But of course, we won't in truth know whether or not the polls have got it right until June the 9th. But I think the message you can take away, even if the polls are wrong in terms of the level, they're not wrong in terms of the trend. The trends in this election campaign so far have been dramatic. That big rise in Tory support early on at the expense of UKIP, and subsequently what by historical standards is quite a remarkable rise in Labour support, albeit from a very low initial baseline. So this election has already seen quite a lot of movement, and therefore perhaps we shouldn't rule out the possibility there'll be yet more in the 10 days that is still to come.
John Curtice, thank you very much. Well, that's his analysis of the polls so far. Let's look at the implications with our panel. Julia, first of all, in your mind, how concerned should Conservative headquarters be at this particular point and what looks like an apparent surge by Labour in the polls?
Well, it depends, doesn't it, whether you want to have a massive landslide majority or not, which I'm assuming the Tory party do. Whether that is what the vast majority of voters from any party think is a good idea is a completely different matter. But undoubtedly, the manifesto launch was an absolute disaster.
Over the social care
policy and the U-turn, and I would say the free breakfast and various other things. Lots of stuff in the Labour manifesto was very appealing. What I find fascinating is the tactic from Sir Linton Crosby was very clear. It's all about Theresa May. Don't even mention the candidates, don't mention the party. It's all about Theresa May. And the Labour Party, the candidates on the moderate side...
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.